There's a voice in your head that notices every mistake, replays every awkward moment, and predicts failure before you even begin. It sounds like you, but it isn't. This voice evolved to keep you alive, not happy. Tonight, we're uncovering why your brain is biased toward negativity and how an ancient survival system became your modern inner critic. Let's start with something you've probably never thought about consciously. Your brain never stops talking. Right now, as you're listening to this, there's a constant stream of commentary running beneath your awareness. It's narrating your experience, judging your choices, predicting outcomes, and evaluating threats. This isn't something you turned on. You didn't ask for it. It's simply what brains do. The human mind is an automatic narrative generator. From the moment you wake until you fall asleep, and even in your dreams, your brain is constructing stories about who you are, what's happening, and what it all means. This is the default mode network in action, a collection of brain regions that activate when you're not focused on the external world. When you're in the shower, driving on autopilot, or lying in bed at night, this network fires up and starts generating self-referential thought. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of that internal chatter isn't positive. Think about the last time you sat in complete silence. No phone, no music, no conversation. What happened? For most people, silence doesn't feel peaceful, it feels exposing. Within moments, thoughts rush in to fill the void. And more often than not, those thoughts aren't affirming. They're critical, worried, anxious. Your brain starts scanning for problems. Did I say the wrong thing earlier? Am I falling behind? What if this doesn't work out? Why does the brain do this? Because silence, to your nervous system, signals vulnerability. In ancestral environments, extended quiet meant you might be alone, exposed, or missing important information. Your brain evolved to fill that space with predictions, assessments, and warnings. It's trying to help you prepare. But in the process, it often generates suffering. The inner critic emerges from this constant prediction machine. Your brain's primary job isn't to make you happy, it's to keep you alive. And to do that effectively, it needs to anticipate threats before they materialize. This means your mind is constantly running simulations. What could go wrong? Where am I vulnerable? What haven't I prepared for? These simulations feel like thoughts about you, but they're actually thoughts about survival. The problem is that your brain doesn't distinguish between physical danger and social discomfort, between a genuine threat and a perceived inadequacy. To your nervous system, the fear of looking foolish in a meeting triggers the same alarm bells as encountering a predator. So negative thoughts arrive uninvited. They just appear. You don't consciously decide to doubt yourself or replay embarrassing moments. These thoughts emerge automatically from a brain trying to protect you. This is crucial to understand. The inner critic is automatic, not intentional. You didn't create it through moral failure or weakness. It's a feature of human consciousness, carved by evolution over millions of years. Most people spend their lives believing they are their thoughts, especially the critical ones. When your mind says, "You're not good enough," you don't hear it as a brain-generated prediction. You hear it as truth. When it replays that awkward conversation from 3 years ago, you don't recognize it as your threat detection system misfiring. You feel fresh shame, as if it's happening again right now. This is the fundamental confusion at the heart of human suffering. We mistake the brain's automatic commentary for reality itself. We believe the inner critic because it sounds like us. It uses our voice, our memories, our language. But it isn't us. It's an ancient algorithm running on outdated software, designed for a world that no longer exists. Negativity bias, the brain's survival filter. Now let's go deeper into why the inner critic skews so heavily toward negativity. This isn't random. It's not a design flaw. It's a survival feature called negativity bias, and it's one of the most powerful forces shaping your moment-to-moment experience. Negativity bias means your brain weighs negative experiences more heavily than positive ones. Neurologically, emotionally, and cognitively, bad is stronger than good. This has been demonstrated across thousands of studies. People remember criticism more than praise, dwell on failures more than successes, and react more intensely to threats than rewards. Here's a concrete example. Imagine you receive 10 compliments and 1 criticism in a single day. Which one do you think about as you're falling asleep? The criticism. Your brain practically ignores the compliments. They're pleasant but not urgent. The criticism, however, activates your threat detection circuitry. Your mind rehearses it, analyzes it, defends against it. One negative experience can psychologically outweigh 10 positive ones. Why? Because in the ancestral environments where your brain evolved, missing a positive opportunity was unfortunate. Missing a threat was fatal. If you failed to notice a few berries on a bush, you'd just be slightly less full. If you failed to notice the rustling in the grass that signaled a predator, you'd be removed from the gene pool. Natural selection ruthlessly favored brains that prioritized threat detection over pleasure seeking. This is why bad memories stick longer than compliments. A harsh word from a parent can echo for decades, while hundreds of loving moments fade into a general sense of background warmth. A single embarrassing moment from high school can feel more vivid and present than years of ordinary, pleasant interactions. Your brain has an asymmetrical storage system. Negative experiences are encoded more deeply, retrieved more easily, and rehearsed more frequently. Think of your mind as a threat detection machine, not a happiness engine. Its primary function isn't to generate joy or contentment, it's to scan the environment for anything that could go wrong. This is why your brain is so good at finding problems. You walk into a party where 99 people seem to be having a good time, and your attention immediately goes to the one person who looks uncomfortable. You give a presentation that goes well overall, but you fixate on the single question you stumbled over. Your mind isn't being cruel, it's doing exactly what evolution designed it to do. Here's the analogy that captures this perfectly. Your brain is a smoke alarm that goes off even when toast burns. Smoke alarms are deliberately oversensitive because the cost of a false alarm, minor annoyance, is trivial compared to the cost of missing a real fire. Your brain operates on the same principle. It would rather have you anxious about 100 non-threats than miss the one genuine danger. This is why you catastrophize, why you imagine worst-case scenarios, why your mind jumps to disaster even when things are going well. It's not that you're broken or pessimistic by nature, it's that your brain is running an algorithm optimized for ancient survival, not modern flourishing. The tragic irony is that this system, which evolved to protect you, now often generates the majority of your suffering. In a modern environment where actual physical threats are rare, your negativity bias turns inward. It scans your own behavior, your own thoughts, your own worth. And because it's designed to find threats, it finds them in your mistakes, your inadequacies, your vulnerabilities. This is the foundation of the inner critic. It's negativity bias turned against the self. Your brain, unable to find saber-toothed tigers in your environment, starts hunting for flaws in you. Every misstep becomes evidence of unworthiness. Every setback becomes confirmation of inadequacy. The same mechanism that kept your ancestors alive now keeps you awake at 3 a.m, rehearsing failures and predicting doom. Evolution's shadow. Why worry kept us alive? To truly understand the inner critic, we need to travel back in time. Not decades or centuries, but millions of years. We need to understand the environments that sculpted human consciousness, because the brain you have today wasn't designed for the life you're living. It was designed for a world of constant unpredictability and lethal danger. Picture the environment our ancestors inhabited for the vast majority of human history. No grocery stores, no hospitals, no police, no weather forecasts, no safety nets of any kind. Every day brought genuine threats: predators, hostile tribes, food scarcity, disease, exposure to the elements. Death was common, sudden, and often violent. Infant mortality was staggering. Most people didn't live long enough to develop gray hair. In that world, overthinking was a survival advantage. The person who constantly worried about where the next meal would come from was more likely to store food. The person who obsessively scanned for danger was more likely to spot threats early. The person who replayed social mistakes in their mind was more likely to maintain crucial tribal alliances. Anxiety, rumination, and hypervigilance weren't disorders. They were features that increased reproductive success. Here's the key insight: fear-based brains reproduced more successfully. Imagine 2 of our ancestors living side by side. One is naturally calm, optimistic, and present-focused. The other is anxious, hypervigilant, and always imagining worst-case scenarios. When a predator approaches, who's more likely to survive? The worrier, who's already planned escape routes and noticed the warning signs. The calm person might have a more pleasant moment-to-moment experience, but they're also more likely to be caught off guard. This selection pressure operated for millions of years. Generation after generation, the genes that promoted worry, threat detection, and negative focus were passed on. The genes that promoted relaxation and contentment, many of those went extinct along with the people who carried them. Calm brains didn't always live long enough to pass their genes forward. You are the descendant of the worriers. Every anxious, hypervigilant, overthinking ancestor in your lineage survived long enough to reproduce. The calm ones, many of them didn't make it. This is why anxiety feels so natural, so automatic, so deeply woven into your psychology. It's in your DNA. It's not something you developed through bad habits or negative thinking. It's something you inherited from a long line of survivors who worried their way through a dangerous world. The same is true for social anxiety. In ancestral environments, being excluded from your tribe was often a death sentence. Humans survived through cooperation, and maintaining your social standing was as important as avoiding predators. This is why rejection feels so viscerally painful, why embarrassment triggers such intense shame, why your mind obsessively replays social mistakes. Your brain treats social threats like physical threats because, for most of human history, they were equally dangerous. The inner critic emerges from this legacy. That voice that tells you you're not enough. That's the voice of ancient caution, warning you that any sign of weakness or inadequacy could lead to rejection. That constant comparison to others. That's your brain monitoring your social rank, something that determined your access to resources and mates. That fear of trying new things. That's inherited wisdom from ancestors who learned that novelty often came with risk. But here's the profound problem. The brain didn't evolve for modern comfort, it evolved for ancient danger. The environment has changed radically in just the past few hundred years, and especially in the last few decades. But evolution moves slowly. Your brain is still running software designed for the Pleistocene era, trying to navigate a world of emails, social media, performance reviews, and existential choices. You're not facing saber-toothed tigers, but your brain treats a critical email from your boss with the same alarm. You're not at risk of being exiled from your tribe, but your nervous system responds to Instagram comparison as if your survival depends on it. You're not hunting for scarce resources, but your mind generates the same anxiety about career success as if starvation were imminent. This mismatch is the source of enormous suffering. You have a hyper-vigilant, threat-focused, survival-oriented brain trying to operate in an environment where most threats are psychological, not physical. Where success is measured in abstract metrics like status and achievement, not in concrete survival. Where danger rarely appears suddenly, but stress accumulates chronically. The inner critic is evolution's shadow. It's the voice of every worried ancestor who survived to pass on their genes. It kept them alive. But in your life, it often keeps you small, afraid, and suffering. Understanding this doesn't make it go away, but it does help you see it for what it is. An outdated survival system doing its best in a world it wasn't designed for. The neural loop of self-criticism. Now let's examine what happens inside your brain when the inner critic speaks. Because this isn't just psychological, it's deeply neurological. Every negative thought you have creates a physical change in your brain, and over time, those changes become self-reinforcing patterns that are harder and harder to escape. When you're not focused on a specific task, when your attention isn't absorbed by the external world, a network of brain regions becomes active. This is called the default mode network, or DMN. It includes areas like the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and parts of the temporal lobe. These regions activate during rest, daydreaming, and self-reflection. The DMN is where self-referential thought happens. This is the neural substrate of your inner narrator, the voice that constructs your sense of self and generates the ongoing commentary about your life. When you think about who you are, what you've done, what you should do, what others think of you, that's the DMN at work. Here's the problem. For many people, the DMN has a pronounced negative bias. Studies show that when the DMN is active, people are less happy than when they're absorbed in focused activities. Why? Because the DMN tends to generate rumination, repetitive, negative, self-focused thought. It rehearses regrets. It anticipates failures. It compares you unfavorably to others. It generates the inner critic's endless stream of judgment. This brings us to a critical principle of neuroscience. Repetition strengthens neural pathways. Every time you think a thought, you're activating a specific pattern of neural firing. And every time you repeat that thought, you're strengthening the connections between those neurons. The technical phrase is neurons that fire together, wire together. This is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reshape itself based on experience. Think of it like walking through a forest. The first time you take a particular route, you're pushing through underbrush, stepping over logs, finding your way slowly. But if you walk that same route every day, you create a path. Eventually, that path becomes a trail. With enough repetition, it becomes a wide, cleared road that you can walk down without even thinking about it. Every negative thought is a path. Every repetition turns it into a highway. This is why certain self-critical thoughts become automatic. You don't consciously decide to think, "I'm not good enough." It just appears instantly in response to certain triggers. That's because you've thought it thousands of times before. You've created a neural superhighway for that thought. Your brain can travel it effortlessly, unconsciously. And here's where things get particularly difficult. Thinking about thoughts makes them louder. This is the paradox of rumination. When you notice a negative thought and then start analyzing it, questioning it, arguing with it, replaying it, you're actually strengthening it. You're giving it more attention, more energy, more neural activation. You think you're solving the problem, but you're actually deepening the groove. Imagine you think, "I'm going to fail at this project." If you could let that thought pass like a cloud in the sky, it would have minimal impact. But instead, you grab onto it. You start examining it. Why do I think that? Is it true? What evidence is there? What if I really do fail? What will that mean about me? How will others react? Now you're not just having one negative thought, you're generating dozens of related thoughts, each one reinforcing the original pattern. This is rumination as neural reinforcement. Every time you chew on a worry, every time you replay an embarrassing moment, every time you catastrophize about the future, you're literally strengthening the neural circuitry that generates those experiences. You're training your brain to go there more easily, more frequently, more automatically. The research on this is clear and sobering. People who ruminate more have stronger activation in the DMN. They have more developed neural pathways for self-critical thought. Over time, rumination doesn't just feel bad, it changes the physical structure of your brain, making negativity your default mode. This is why some people seem to have a natural tendency toward optimism, while others default to pessimism. It's not just personality or life circumstances, it's neural architecture. Someone who has spent years practicing worry has built robust neural networks for generating anxious thoughts. Someone who has spent years practicing gratitude or optimism has built different networks. The brain you have today is the product of the thoughts you've rehearsed yesterday. But here's the crucial point, and we'll return to this later. If repetition strengthens negative pathways, then repetition can also strengthen positive ones. The brain that learned to criticize can learn to observe. The pathways that carry judgment can be gradually overshadowed by pathways that carry compassion. This isn't easy, and it isn't quick, but it's possible. Neuroplasticity works in both directions. For now, though, the key insight is this. The inner critic gets louder not because you're broken, but because you've practiced listening to it. Every time you believe its voice, every time you rehearse its stories, every time you give it your attention, you're casting a vote for that neural pattern. You're telling your brain, "This is important. This is who I am. Generate more of this." And your brain, doing exactly what evolution designed it to do, obliges. Why the inner critic feels like you. Here's one of the most unsettling discoveries in neuroscience. Thoughts arise before conscious awareness. By the time you become aware of a thought, your brain has already been processing it for a fraction of a second. The subjective experience of having a thought is actually you noticing something your brain already generated. This has profound implications for understanding the inner critic. When that critical voice speaks, it doesn't feel like something your brain is doing. It feels like something you are thinking. It feels like your genuine perspective, your true assessment of reality. But this is an illusion. An incredibly convincing one, but an illusion nonetheless. Research into the neuroscience of consciousness, particularly the work of Benjamin Libet and others, has shown that there's a measurable gap between neural activity and conscious awareness. Your brain makes decisions, generates thoughts, and initiates actions before you, the conscious experiencer, become aware of them. What you experience as conscious choice is often post hoc awareness of processes that have already occurred beneath the surface. This is the illusion of authorship. You believe you're the creator of your thoughts because you experience them in your mind, in your voice, from your perspective. But thoughts arise spontaneously from a complex web of neural activity, influenced by genetics, past experiences, current emotional state, environmental triggers, and countless other factors you're not consciously controlling. Think about it, you don't decide what to think next. Thoughts just appear. Right now, as you're listening to this, you can't predict what thought will arise in the next moment. If you were truly the author of your thoughts, you'd have complete control over them. You'd never think a thought you didn't want to think. But that's not how it works. Thoughts arrive, unbidden, and you simply witness them. This is especially true for negative thoughts. The inner critic doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for you to consciously decide it's time for self-doubt. It just shows up, fully formed, speaking in your voice, using your memories and insecurities as ammunition. And because it sounds like you, because it uses first-person language, I'm not good enough. Not you're not good enough. You naturally assume it represents your genuine beliefs. But here's the truth. Your brain mistakes familiarity for truth. The reason the inner critic sounds so convincing isn't because it's accurate, it's because it's familiar. You've heard these criticisms before, usually starting in childhood, maybe from parents, teachers, peers, or society. Over time, you internalized those external voices, and they became the inner critic's script. Your brain, encountering these familiar thoughts repeatedly, starts to treat them as true. This is the mere exposure effect applied to cognition. The more you're exposed to an idea, the more your brain accepts it as valid, regardless of its actual accuracy. The inner critic gains power not through evidence, but through repetition. This is why people can believe obviously distorted things about themselves. Someone objectively accomplished can genuinely believe they're a failure. Someone objectively attractive can genuinely believe they're ugly. Someone objectively kind can genuinely believe they're selfish. The inner critic has repeated these narratives so many times that they feel like fundamental truths rather than learned stories. And here's the danger of believing every thought. When you take the inner critic's voice as accurate, you start making decisions based on distorted information. You turn down opportunities because the critic says you'll fail. You avoid relationships because the critic says you're unworthy. You play small because the critic convinces you that's all you can handle. You're not making choices based on reality. You're making choices based on an algorithm your brain is running. Most people go through their entire lives never questioning this. They assume that because a thought occurs in their mind, it must be true or important. They never step back and ask, is this thought accurate? Is it helpful? Or is it just my brain's threat detection system generating its usual static? The cognitive revolution in psychology, starting with Aaron Beck and continuing through modern neuroscience, has revealed this clearly. Thoughts are events in the mind, not facts about reality. Just because you think something doesn't make it true. Just because your inner critic says you're inadequate doesn't mean you are. It simply means your brain generated that thought, probably because it's a well-worn neural pathway activated by some trigger in your environment or emotional state. Understanding this creates a crucial opening. If thoughts arise automatically and don't necessarily reflect truth, then you don't have to believe them. You don't have to identify with them. You don't have to let them dictate your choices. This is the beginning of freedom, recognizing that the inner critic is a voice in your head, not the truth about who you are. The loudest voice is not the most accurate, it's the most practiced. That sentence deserves to be written down, memorized, tattooed on your brain. The inner critic dominates not because it has superior wisdom, but because it's had more practice. It's been rehearsed more, reinforced more, given more attention. It's the neural equivalent of a person who talks constantly. They don't have more valuable things to say, they just take up more space. The critical insight here is that you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts arise. You're the space in which the inner critic speaks, not the critic itself. Most people never make this distinction. They identify completely with their mental activity, never realizing there's a deeper awareness observing it all. This might sound abstract or philosophical, but it has immediate practical implications. Once you recognize that thoughts are events you're experiencing rather than truths you're thinking, you can start to change your relationship with the inner critic. You can observe it without obeying it. You can hear it without believing it. You can acknowledge its presence without giving it control. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what happens when you do believe the critic, when you identify with its voice completely. What happens in your brain and body when the inner critic takes control? Emotional hijacking, when the critic takes control. Let's talk about what happens in your body when the inner critic speaks. Because this isn't just a mental event, it's a full system physiological response that can literally hijack your consciousness and lock you into patterns of distorted thinking. When your inner critic fires, especially when it's triggered by stress or perceived threat, your amygdala activates. This almond-shaped structure deep in your brain is part of your threat detection system. It's constantly scanning your environment and your internal state for danger. And here's the critical point. The amygdala doesn't distinguish between real physical threats and perceived psychological threats. Being criticized by your boss, imagining failure, replaying an embarrassing moment, these aren't physically dangerous, but your amygdala responds as if they are. It initiates the stress response, triggering the release of cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate increases. Your breathing shallows. Blood flow redirects from your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thinking, perspective, and emotional regulation, to your limbic system and your muscles, preparing you for fight or flight. This is emotional hijacking. Your higher cognitive functions are literally compromised. The parts of your brain that could offer perspective, recognize distortions, and generate alternative interpretations are suppressed. Meanwhile, the parts focused on threat detection and survival are amplified. Stress hormones amplify negative self-talk. When cortisol floods your system, your brain becomes even more biased toward negative information. You become hypervigilant for additional threats. Your attention narrows. You lose access to nuance, context, and balanced thinking. The inner critic, already loud, becomes deafening. This is why anxiety and self-criticism feed each other in a vicious cycle. Anxiety triggers stress hormones, which amplify negative thoughts, which generate more anxiety, which releases more stress hormones. Each cycle makes the next one easier to trigger. Over time, this can become your default state, a chronic low-level activation of the stress response, with the inner critic providing a constant stream of threatening narratives. Fear narrows perception. When you're anxious, you literally see less. Your attentional focus contracts. You become unable to see the bigger picture. You can't access memories of past successes. You can't imagine alternative futures. All you can see is the threat, or in this case, the inadequacy, the mistake, the potential failure that the inner critic is highlighting. This narrowing is adaptive in genuine emergencies. If there's a fire, you don't need to think about your career goals or practice gratitude. You need to focus completely on escape. But when the threat is your inner critic telling you you're not good enough, this narrowing is devastating. It cuts you off from the very cognitive resources you'd need to challenge the criticism or gain perspective. Why anxiety makes thoughts feel urgent and real. This is crucial to understand. When you're in a calm state, a negative thought like "I'm going to fail" can feel like just a thought, uncomfortable but manageable. But when that same thought arises while your stress response is activated, it feels completely different. It feels true. It feels urgent. It feels like a fact you need to respond to immediately. This is because your emotional state colors your perception of your thoughts. Anxiety doesn't just make you feel bad, it makes anxious thoughts feel more valid, more important, more worthy of attention. Your brain interprets the physiological arousal as evidence that the thought is significant. The racing heart, the tension, the stress hormones, your brain reads these signals and concludes, this thought must be important because my body is reacting to it. But this is backwards. Your body is reacting because your amygdala is misfiring, treating a psychological threat as if it were physical. The physiological response isn't validating the thought, it's just demonstrating that your threat detection system is activated. But in the moment, it feels like confirmation. The brain under threat loses nuance. When your stress response is active, your thinking becomes black and white. You lose the ability to hold complexity. Everything becomes extreme. You're not just worried about a presentation, you're convinced it will be a complete disaster. You're not just concerned about a relationship, you're certain it's doomed. You're not just questioning a decision, you're sure you've made a terrible mistake. This is your brain in survival mode. Nuance is a luxury for safe environments. When your amygdala believes you're under threat, it pushes you towards simple, fast, extreme assessments. This is efficient for dodging predators, but it's terrible for evaluating your self-worth or making complex life decisions. The inner critic thrives in this state. When you're emotionally hijacked, you lose access to the part of your brain that could say, wait, is this criticism accurate? Am I catastrophizing? What evidence contradicts this? All you have is the critic's voice and a body that's screaming that something is wrong. This is why people make terrible decisions when they're anxious or stressed. It's why you send the angry email you regret, why you quit when things get hard, why you lash out at people you love. You're not thinking clearly, you're operating from a hijacked state where the inner critic and the stress response are running the show. The tragic irony is that this state is supposed to protect you. Your amygdala is trying to keep you safe. Your stress hormones are trying to prepare you for danger. But in a modern context, where most threats are psychological rather than physical, these systems often create more harm than good. They amplify suffering instead of preventing it. Understanding this doesn't make it stop happening, but it does offer a crucial insight. When the inner critic feels overwhelming, when negative thoughts feel absolutely true and urgent, you're probably in a hijacked state. Your perception is being distorted by stress physiology. The thoughts aren't becoming more accurate, they're becoming more emotionally charged. This is why people often gain perspective after the fact. The next day, after you've calmed down, the presentation you were certain would be a disaster seems manageable. The decision you were sure was catastrophic seems reasonable. The relationship you thought was doomed still has possibility. What changed? Not the external circumstances, your internal state. Your stress response calmed down, your prefrontal cortex came back online, and suddenly you could see nuance again. The goal isn't to never experience emotional hijacking. That's impossible. The goal is to recognize it when it's happening and understand that in those moments, your inner critic's voice is being amplified by biology, not validated by reality. Real life, CONSEQUENCS, deep RELATBLITY section. Now let's bring this down from neuroscience and evolution into the lived experience of what the inner critic actually costs you. Because this isn't just academic, it's the architecture of daily suffering and missed opportunity that defines millions of lives. Imposter syndrome. You've achieved something significant, a promotion, a degree, a creative success, but instead of feeling proud, you feel like a fraud. The inner critic immediately provides an explanation. You got lucky. You fooled people. You're not actually qualified. Any moment now, someone will discover the truth and expose you. This isn't rare. Studies suggest that up to 70% of people experience imposter syndrome at some point. Accomplished professionals, respected experts, celebrated artists, they're walking around convinced they don't deserve their success. The inner critic takes external achievement and transforms it into internal torment. Why? Because the inner critic's job is threat detection, not accurate assessment. And one of the biggest social threats is being exposed as inadequate. So even when you succeed, the critic pivots. Success becomes dangerous because it raises the stakes. Now you have something to lose. Now expectations are higher. Now the potential fall is greater. The critic isn't celebrating your achievement, it's worrying about how to prevent exposure and failure. The cost of imposter syndrome isn't just emotional discomfort. It's the opportunities you turn down because you don't believe you're qualified. It's the credit you refuse to take, which limits your career advancement. It's the chronic stress of constantly trying to prove yourself while simultaneously believing you can't. Many talented people plateau not because of lack of ability, but because their inner critic convinces them they've already exceeded what they deserve. Decision paralysis. You need to make a choice, which job to take, whether to move, how to handle a relationship issue, but you can't. You analyze endlessly. You list pros and cons. You seek advice from everyone, but you still can't decide. Why? Because the inner critic has convinced you that making the wrong choice would be catastrophic, and you're incompetent to judge which choice is right. This is the inner critic's most insidious trick. It doesn't just criticize choices you've made, it preemptively criticizes any choice you might make. Every option is subjected to withering scrutiny. Every path forward is shown to lead to disaster. The safest choice becomes no choice at all. But paralysis is itself a choice, and usually a costly one. Opportunities expire. Situations deteriorate. Relationships drift. Meanwhile, you're frozen, waiting for the perfect clarity that the inner critic will never provide. Because the critic's job isn't to help you decide, it's to prevent you from making mistakes. And the only way to guarantee no mistakes is to do nothing. People lose years to this. Careers stagnate because they can't decide whether to take risks. Relationships remain unfulfilling because they can't decide whether to leave or commit more deeply. Creative projects stay unstarted because they can't decide if they're good enough. The inner critic, supposedly protecting them from failure, instead guarantees a life smaller than their potential. Procrastination driven by fear. You have something important to do. You know you should do it. You genuinely want to do it, but you don't. Instead, you scroll, you clean, you do busy work, you find 1,000 reasons why you can't start right now. This isn't laziness, it's avoidance. And beneath the avoidance is the inner critic. The critic has already previewed your failure. Before you even begin, it's shown you the completed work being rejected, criticized, or revealed as inadequate. So starting feels like walking toward pain. Procrastination offers temporary relief. If you haven't tried yet, you haven't failed yet. If you haven't put your work out there, you haven't been judged yet. The inner critic can't criticize what doesn't exist. But of course, the deadline approaches. The pressure builds. Now you're working in a panicked state, without time for your best effort, guaranteeing a subpar result. And when that happens, the inner critic has the evidence it needs. See, you're not capable, you failed. Except you didn't fail because you're incapable. You failed because the fear of failure prevented you from trying properly. This cycle ruins potential. Talented writers who never finish the book. Skilled professionals who never go for the promotion. Creative people with brilliant ideas who never execute them. Not because they lack ability, but because the inner critic has made the risk of trying more painful than the regret of not trying. Relationship self-sabotage. Someone likes you, maybe even loves you, but the inner critic has a different story. You're not actually worthy of love. They'll eventually see your flaws and leave, so you protect yourself. You push them away. You create distance. You test them. You look for evidence that they're losing interest, and when you can't find it, you unconsciously behave in ways that create it. Or the opposite happens. You become hypervigilant about the relationship's health. You monitor every text for signs of cooling affection. You analyze every interaction for evidence of problems. You need constant reassurance, constant validation, constant proof that you're still valued. The relationship becomes exhausting, not because of genuine problems, but because of the inner critic's constant anxiety about loss. Either way, the prophecy fulfills itself. Pushing people away ensures they leave. Constant need for reassurance pushes people to exhaustion. The relationship fails, and the inner critic points to this as evidence. See, I told you, you're not lovable. The pattern repeats. How many good relationships have been destroyed by inner critics? How many people have spent years alone, not because no one would love them, but because they couldn't believe anyone genuinely could? Chronic stress and burnout. The inner critic never rests. It's always finding something. A flaw to fix, a standard you're not meeting, a potential problem to prevent, a comparison showing you falling short. This generates constant low-level stress. Your nervous system never fully relaxes because there's always something wrong, something threatening, something requiring vigilance. Over time, this becomes chronic stress. Your cortisol levels stay elevated. Your sleep suffers. Your immune system weakens. You experience muscle tension, headaches, digestive issues, the physical manifestations of a brain that believes it's under constant threat. You're exhausted, but you can't rest because the critic tells you rest is lazy, that you haven't done enough to deserve it, that there's still more to do. This leads to burnout. Not the burnout that comes from occasional overwork, but the deep existential burnout that comes from never feeling like you're enough. You're not just tired from doing too much, you're tired from the constant internal battle, the endless self-judgment, the relentless pressure from a voice that sounds like your own, but offers no compassion or peace. The cost is staggering. Relationships deteriorate because you don't have the emotional energy to show up fully. Creativity dries up because creativity requires a sense of safety and play that the inner critic destroys. Physical health declines. Joy becomes rare. You're going through life in a state of chronic threat activation, and the threat is coming from inside your own mind. The truth beneath all of this: many people don't fail due to lack of ability, they quit because of the voice in their head. They have the talent, the intelligence, the opportunity. What they don't have is an inner narrative that allows them to use those gifts. The inner critic has convinced them that trying is dangerous, that success is impossible, that they're fundamentally inadequate. And so they stop, they give up, they settle, not because the external world defeated them, but because the internal voice did. This is what the inner critic truly costs, not just discomfort, but the foreclosure of possibility, the unlived life, the unexpressed potential, the dreams dismissed as unrealistic before they're even attempted, the connections never made, the risks never taken, the self never fully known because it's been hidden behind a wall of criticism. Understanding this isn't about generating more self-criticism. Look, I'm even failing at managing my inner critic. It's about recognizing the stakes. This isn't a small problem. This isn't just being negative. This is the primary obstacle between most people and the life they're capable of living. Why fighting the critic makes it worse? Here's where things get truly counterintuitive. Your instinct when faced with the inner critic is probably to fight it, to argue back, to try to suppress the negative thoughts, to use positive thinking or willpower to overcome the criticism. This seems logical, but it doesn't work. In fact, it often makes everything worse. Welcome to one of the most frustrating paradoxes in psychology, the thought suppression paradox. When you try not to think about something, you think about it more. This has been demonstrated in countless studies, most famously in the white bear experiments. When people are told not to think about white bears, they think about white bears far more frequently than people who weren't given that instruction. Why? Because in order to monitor whether you're successfully not thinking about something, you have to keep checking for it. And every time you check, you're activating the very thought you're trying to suppress. It's like telling yourself, don't think about pink elephants. What just happened? You thought about pink elephants. The instruction to avoid the thought guaranteed its presence. This is the don't think about it effect, and it's devastating when applied to the inner critic. When you notice a self-critical thought and respond with stop thinking that, or don't be so negative, you're actually reinforcing the thought. You're giving it more attention. You're strengthening the neural pathway, and you're creating frustration and failure because thought suppression doesn't work. People spend years trying to eliminate negative thoughts through sheer force of will. They scold themselves for being negative. They try to replace every critical thought with a positive affirmation. They create rules. I'm not allowed to think that way. But all of this is resistance, and resistance strengthens attention. Think of attention like a spotlight. Whatever you point at, it becomes brighter, more vivid, more present. When you try to suppress a thought, you're constantly checking to see if it's there, which means you're constantly shining the spotlight on it. You think you're fighting it, but you're actually giving it energy. This is especially true with emotion-laden thoughts. The inner critic's voice isn't just neutral information. It's charged with shame, fear, and anxiety. When you try to suppress those thoughts, you're also trying to suppress the emotions. And suppressed emotions don't disappear. They go underground, building pressure. Eventually, they erupt, often more intensely than if you'd allowed them initially. Why arguing with thoughts backfires? Another common strategy is to argue with the inner critic. It says, "You're going to fail," and you respond, "No, I'm not, I'm going to succeed." It says, "You're inadequate," and you respond, "I'm perfectly adequate, I've accomplished things." This feels productive. It feels like you're defending yourself, standing up to the bully. But what's actually happening? You're engaging with the critic as if it's a debate partner with valid points that need to be refuted. You're treating its pronouncements as worthy of serious consideration. And most importantly, you're keeping your attention focused on the critical narrative. The inner critic doesn't care if you agree or disagree, it cares about attention. As long as you're arguing with it, you're in relationship with it. You're letting it set the terms of your internal experience. It says, "You're not good enough," and whether you respond with agreement or disagreement, you've accepted its premise that your adequacy is currently under review. This can trap you in an exhausting internal dialogue. Back and forth, back and forth. The critic presents evidence of your inadequacy. You present counter-evidence. The critic dismisses your evidence and presents more of its own. You feel like you're winning the argument, but actually you're just strengthening the pattern. You're rehearsing the criticism, even while you're defending against it. There's also a deeper issue. Arguing with the inner critic implicitly accepts its authority. You're acting as if it's a legitimate judge whose verdict matters. But what if it's not? What if it's just an outdated survival mechanism generating static? You wouldn't spend your day arguing with a smoke alarm that keeps going off unnecessarily. You'd recognize the alarm is malfunctioning, and you'd stop treating its signal as meaningful information. The Chinese finger trap principle. Remember those woven tubes you might have played with as a child? You put a finger in each end, and when you try to pull your fingers out, the trap tightens. The harder you pull, the more stuck you become. The only way out is to do the opposite, to push your fingers in, which loosens the weave and creates space for release. The inner critic works the same way. The more you fight it, the more entrenched it becomes. Resistance creates persistence. The way out isn't through more force, it's through a completely different approach. This is difficult to accept because it feels passive. It feels like surrender. We're taught to fight our problems, to overcome obstacles through effort and determination. But consciousness doesn't work that way. You can't bully your mind into submission. You can't force yourself to stop thinking certain thoughts. The harder you try, the more exhausted you become, and the thoughts remain. Think about insomnia. When you desperately try to force yourself to sleep, you create anxiety about sleep, which makes sleep impossible. The only way to sleep is to stop trying to sleep, to let go of the agenda and allow sleep to come if and when it will. The same is true for the inner critic. The only way to quiet it is to stop fighting it. But what does that look like? If you're not suppressing the thoughts and you're not arguing with them, what are you supposed to do? That's what we'll explore next. But first, you need to fully accept this truth. Fighting the inner critic is like fighting quicksand. Every struggle pulls you deeper. The path out requires a fundamentally different relationship with your thoughts, one based on observation rather than control, on acceptance rather than resistance, on space rather than struggle. This doesn't mean accepting the critic's message. You don't have to believe you're inadequate just because you're not fighting the thought. It means accepting the thought's presence without giving it authority. It means recognizing that thoughts arise, they exist for a moment, and then they pass, unless you grab onto them and give them power through resistance or belief. Most people have spent their lives in a war with their own minds, trying to eliminate negative thoughts through force. And most people have lost that war, not because they're weak, but because the war was unwinnable. You can't defeat thoughts by fighting them. You can only deprive them of significance by changing your relationship with them. Rewiring the brain. QITNG, the inner critic. Here's where we shift from understanding the problem to exploring solutions. But let me be clear from the start. There is no quick fix. The inner critic developed over millions of years of evolution and years of personal conditioning. It won't disappear overnight. Anyone promising a simple technique that will eliminate it permanently is either lying or doesn't understand how consciousness works. But that doesn't mean you're helpless. While you can't delete the inner critic, you can change your relationship with it. You can reduce its power. You can create alternative neural pathways that offer different perspectives. You can train your mind to observe the critic's voice without being controlled by it. This is possible, supported by decades of research, and practiced successfully by millions of people. The foundation of all of this is a concept we've touched on but need to explore more deeply: neuroplasticity. Your brain is not fixed. The neural pathways you have today are not permanent. Every experience you have, every thought you think, every behavior you practice creates physical changes in your brain. The brain is constantly rewiring itself based on where you direct your attention and what you repeatedly practice. This is simultaneously liberating and demanding. Liberating because it means change is possible. The negative patterns aren't permanent. The inner critic's dominance isn't your destiny. But demanding because real change requires consistent practice over time. You're not just trying to think different thoughts, you're trying to build new neural infrastructure. Thought labeling is one of the most empirically validated techniques for managing difficult thoughts. It's deceptively simple but profoundly effective. When you notice the inner critic speaking, instead of believing it or fighting it, you simply label it. This is a fear response. This is the inner critic. This is my mind catastrophizing. What does this do? It creates distance. It reminds you that thoughts are events in consciousness, not facts about reality. It activates your prefrontal cortex, the observing, rational part of your brain, rather than leaving you fully immersed in the limbic system's emotional reactivity. Research shows that even just labeling an emotion reduces its intensity. Brain scans reveal that when people name their emotions, activation in the amygdala decreases while activation in the prefrontal cortex increases. You're literally shifting which part of your brain is dominant. You're moving from reactive mode to observing mode. The key is to label without judgment. Don't say, "This is stupid negative thinking and I shouldn't be doing this." That's just more criticism. Instead, "This is the inner critic. It's doing what it evolved to do." You're acknowledging the thought's presence without giving it authority or attacking yourself for having it. Practice this consistently, hundreds of times, thousands of times. Every time the critic speaks, label it. Over time, this creates a new habit. Instead of automatically believing critical thoughts, you automatically recognize them as thoughts. This might sound like a small shift, but it's revolutionary. It's the difference between "I am a failure" and "I'm having the thought that I'm a failure." The first is identity. The second is observation. Cognitive distancing takes this further. It's the practice of observing your thoughts as if they were external events, like watching cars pass on a highway or clouds drift across the sky. You're not in the car. You're not the cloud. You're the awareness in which these things are appearing. This is a core principle in mindfulness and contemplative traditions, but it's now well supported by cognitive neuroscience. When you practice observing thoughts rather than identifying with them, you strengthen the neural networks associated with meta-awareness, awareness of awareness itself. You develop what's called the observing self, a perspective that can witness your mental activity without being swept away by it. Try this right now. Notice whatever thoughts are present. Don't change them or judge them. Just notice them arising. See if you can sense that there's an awareness here that's observing the thoughts. That awareness isn't thinking the thoughts, it's the space in which thoughts appear. You are that awareness, not the thoughts themselves. This isn't just philosophy. It's a trainable cognitive skill with measurable effects. People who practice cognitive distancing show reduced rumination, lower anxiety, and better emotional regulation. They still have negative thoughts. Everyone does, but they're less controlled by them. Self-compassion as nervous system regulation. This is perhaps the most powerful and least practiced approach. Most people respond to their inner critic with more criticism. They judge themselves for being judgmental. They attack themselves for feeling inadequate. They're harsh with themselves about being too harsh. This compounds the suffering. Self-compassion offers a radically different approach. When you notice the inner critic, instead of fighting it or believing it, you respond with kindness. Not indulgent self-pity, but the same warmth and understanding you'd offer a close friend who is struggling. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion has shown remarkable results. People who practice self-compassion have lower anxiety and depression, greater resilience, and better emotional well-being. And here's what's crucial. Self-compassion is associated with lower levels of cortisol. It literally calms your nervous system. Remember emotional hijacking. When the stress response is activated, the inner critic gets amplified. Self-compassion is one of the most effective ways to deactivate the stress response. When you treat yourself with kindness, you signal to your nervous system that you're safe. The amygdala calms down. The prefrontal cortex comes back online. You regain access to perspective, nuance, and balanced thinking. What does self-compassion look like in practice? When the inner critic says, "You're such a failure," instead of arguing or suppressing, you might say internally, "This is really hard. I'm struggling, and that's okay. Everyone struggles. I can be kind to myself while I work through this." Notice what this does. It acknowledges the difficulty without amplifying it. It normalizes the struggle without making it an identity. It offers support instead of additional attack. This isn't about positive thinking or pretending everything is fine. It's about meeting your pain with care instead of contempt. Mindfulness without force. Mindfulness has become somewhat of a buzzword, often misunderstood as a technique for eliminating thoughts or achieving permanent calm. That's not what it is. Mindfulness is the practice of paying attention to present moment experience with acceptance and without judgment. When applied to the inner critic, mindfulness means allowing the critical thoughts to be present without trying to change them and without believing them. You're creating space for the thoughts to exist while also recognizing they're just thoughts. This is delicate. It's not passive resignation. "Fine, I'm terrible and I'll just accept it." It's active awareness. There's a thought that I'm terrible. That thought is arising. It's uncomfortable. I can feel the sensations it creates in my body, and I can let it be here without acting on it or identifying with it. The research on mindfulness is extensive. Regular practice is associated with changes in brain structure, particularly in areas related to attention, emotion regulation, and self-awareness. People who meditate regularly show less activation in the default mode network. Remember, that's the network associated with rumination and the inner critic. They still have the network, but it's not as dominant. But here's the crucial point. Mindfulness isn't about achieving a special state. It's about changing your relationship with whatever state is present. You can be mindful of anxiety, mindful of self-criticism, mindful of discomfort. You're not trying to force these states away. You're allowing them to be present while recognizing their temporary experiences, not permanent truths. Creating alternative neural pathways. All of these practices share a common mechanism. They're building new neural pathways that offer alternatives to the inner critic's dominance. Every time you label a thought, you strengthen the observing pathway. Every time you practice self-compassion, you strengthen the self-kindness pathway. Every time you create distance from your thoughts, you strengthen the meta-awareness pathway. This is how neuroplasticity works. You can't directly delete old pathways, those neural grooves remain, but you can build new pathways that become progressively stronger. Eventually, when a trigger arises, your brain has multiple options. It can take the old superhighway of self-criticism, or it can take the newer path of self-compassion or observation. At first, the new paths feel awkward and require conscious effort. The old patterns still feel automatic and true, but with practice, months and years of practice, the new paths become stronger. They become more accessible. Eventually, they can become as automatic as the old ones. This is not about perfection. You will still have days, maybe weeks, where the inner critic dominates. You'll still believe the critical thoughts sometimes. You'll still get caught in rumination. This is normal. Progress isn't linear, and you're working against millions of years of evolutionary programming plus your personal conditioning. But slowly, gradually, the balance shifts. The critic is still there, but it's quieter. It speaks, but you don't automatically believe it. It generates its usual narratives, but you can observe them without being controlled by them. This is what's possible, not the elimination of the inner critic, but a fundamental shift in your relationship with it. You don't silence the critic, you outgrow it. This is the goal. Not to become someone who never has negative thoughts, but to become someone who can hold those thoughts lightly. To recognize them as one perspective among many, generated by an ancient survival system, not a reflection of truth or worth. This outgrowing happens naturally when you stop feeding the critic with belief and resistance, and instead feed the alternative pathways with attention and practice. You're training your brain to default to observation and compassion instead of identification and judgment. It's the work of a lifetime, but it's also the most important work you can do, because your relationship with your own mind determines the quality of every moment you're alive. A new relationship with your mind. We've covered a lot of ground, from evolutionary biology to neuroscience to practical techniques. Now we need to integrate all of this into a coherent understanding of what it means to live with an inner critic, and how to gradually shift from being controlled by it to coexisting with it peacefully. The fundamental shift is this: seeing thoughts as signals, not commands. Right now, for most people, thoughts feel like orders that must be obeyed. The inner critic says, "You're going to fail," and you feel compelled to either believe it or fight it. But both responses give the thought power. What if thoughts are just signals, information about your current mental state, but not necessarily information about reality? The inner critic's voice tells you something about your nervous system. It's activated, it's in threat detection mode, but it doesn't tell you something true about your capability or worth. Think of it this way: if your car's check engine light comes on, that's a signal. It means something in the system might need attention. But you don't panic. You don't conclude the car is worthless. You don't spend hours arguing with the dashboard. You acknowledge the signal, and when appropriate, you investigate what triggered it. The inner critic is like a check engine light that's overly sensitive. It goes off constantly, often for no good reason. Understanding this changes everything. You can notice the signal without giving it ultimate authority. You can acknowledge, "My inner critic is active right now," without concluding, "Therefore, I am inadequate." This leads to the practice of training awareness over identification. Most people are completely identified with their thoughts. When a thought arises, there's no gap between the thought and their sense of self. "I'm a failure" feels like a statement about who they are, not a temporary mental event. But you can train awareness, the capacity to observe mental events without identifying with them. This is what meditation, mindfulness, and contemplative practice are fundamentally about. Not achieving special states, but developing the ability to see thoughts as thoughts, emotions as emotions, sensations as sensations, without being consumed by them. This awareness is always present. Right now, there's something in you that's aware of these words, aware of your own thoughts about them, aware of the room around you, aware of being aware. Most people never notice this awareness because they're too identified with the content of consciousness. But it's there, and it can be strengthened. The more you practice awareness, the more you naturally shift from inner critic to inner observer. The critic is judgmental, harsh, threat-focused. The observer is neutral, curious, accepting. The critic says, "This is terrible and means something awful about you." The observer says, "This is what's arising right now." This doesn't mean you become passive or lack discernment. The observer can still notice problems and make decisions, but it does so from a place of clarity rather than panic, from awareness rather than identification. Imagine you're watching a movie. If you're completely absorbed, you forget you're watching, you're immersed in the story, experiencing its emotions as if they're happening to you. But if you step back, you remember, this is a movie. It's affecting, it's compelling, but it's not reality. You can be moved by it without being controlled by it. Your thoughts are like that movie. The inner critic is telling a story. The story can be compelling. It can generate genuine emotion, but it's still a story, not reality. The observer perspective allows you to be aware of the story without being lost in it. This leads to what might be the most important skill in emotional intelligence: choosing response over reaction. When the inner critic speaks, you have a choice point. You can react automatically, believing the thought, fighting it, acting on it. Or you can respond consciously, observing it, labeling it, choosing how to engage with it. Reaction is unconscious and immediate. Response is conscious and considered. Reaction is controlled by the stimulus. Response chooses how to relate to the stimulus. Every practice we've discussed, thought labeling, cognitive distancing, self-compassion, mindfulness, is fundamentally about expanding the space between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl famously wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." This space is what you're cultivating. Right now, for most people, there is no space. The inner critic speaks, and they're immediately in reaction, believing it, drowning in it, fighting it. But with practice, space develops. The critic speaks, and there's a moment, perhaps just a fraction of a second at first, where you can observe it before reacting to it. In that moment, you have choice. You can label it. You can distance from it. You can respond with compassion. You can simply let it be while you choose your next action based on your values rather than your fears. This space is freedom. Not freedom from having difficult thoughts, you'll always have those, but freedom from being controlled by them. This is what's possible. A life where the inner critic still exists, still speaks, but no longer dominates your choices or defines your sense of self. What this looks like in practice, you're about to give a presentation. The inner critic says, "You're going to mess this up. Everyone will judge you. You're not prepared enough." In reaction mode, you'd either believe this and become paralyzed by anxiety, or you'd fight it with forced positive thinking that doesn't quite convince you. In response mode, you notice the thought. You label it. "This is my brain's threat detection system activating. It's trying to protect me by highlighting risks." You feel the anxiety in your body without resisting it. You offer yourself compassion. "This is hard. Presentations trigger my fear of judgment. That's normal and okay." And then you choose your action based on your values and goals, not on the inner critic's warnings. You give the presentation anyway, with the anxiety present but not in control. This is what growth looks like. Not the absence of difficult thoughts and emotions, but the ability to hold them while still moving toward what matters to you. Over time, something remarkable happens. As you consistently practice responding rather than reacting, the inner critic's volume naturally decreases. Not because you've suppressed it, but because you've stopped giving it the attention and belief that amplified it. You've built alternative neural pathways that offer different perspectives. You've trained your nervous system that the critic's warnings don't need to trigger full threat response. The critic still appears, but it's like background noise in a busy cafe, present, but not demanding your full attention. You can hear it without being disturbed by it. You can acknowledge it without being defined by it. This is psychological maturity. This is emotional freedom. Not a life without difficulty, but a life where difficulty doesn't determine your experience or limit your possibilities. Closing reflection. Let's bring this full circle. We started by understanding that the inner critic is an ancient survival mechanism, carved by millions of years of evolution and reinforced by personal experience. We explored how it operates through negativity bias, neural pathways, and emotional hijacking. We saw how it manifests in imposter syndrome, decision paralysis, procrastination, and relationship struggles. We examined why fighting it makes it worse. And we explored how to gradually shift our relationship with it through observation, compassion, and awareness. Here's what you need to remember. Your brain learned to protect you in a world that no longer exists. The environments that shaped human consciousness were genuinely dangerous. Constant vigilance, negative focus, and harsh self-judgment were survival advantages. Your ancestors worried their way through a lethal world, and they passed those worry-prone genes to you. The inner critic is their legacy. But the world has changed. You're not facing predators or starvation or exile from your tribe. The threats you face are mostly psychological, social, and existential. And for those threats, the inner critic is not just unhelpful, it's actively harmful. It creates the suffering it claims to be preventing. Understanding this is the first act of freedom. You didn't create the inner critic through failure or weakness. You inherited it. It's doing what it was designed to do. The problem isn't that you're broken, it's that you're running ancient software in a modern world. The second act of freedom is recognizing that you're not your thoughts. The inner critic speaks in your voice, uses your memories, knows your vulnerabilities. But it isn't you. You are the awareness in which the critic's voice appears. You are the space in which thoughts arise and pass. You are not the content of consciousness. You are consciousness itself. This isn't abstract philosophy. This is the practical foundation for every technique we've discussed. When you can observe your thoughts rather than identify with them, everything changes. The critic loses its power not because you've defeated it, but because you've stopped mistaking it for reality. The third act of freedom is practice. Everything we've discussed, thought labeling, cognitive distancing, self-compassion, mindfulness, these aren't ideas to understand intellectually. They're skills to practice consistently. You're rewiring your brain, building new neural pathways, training a fundamentally different relationship with your mind. This takes time, months, years, a lifetime. But every moment of practice matters. Every time you label a critical thought instead of believing it, you're casting a vote for a different pattern. Every time you respond with self-compassion instead of self-attack, you're training your nervous system towards safety instead of threat. Every time you observe without identifying, you're strengthening the witness consciousness that can hold all experience without being overwhelmed by it. Progress won't be linear. You'll have days where the old patterns dominate. You'll believe the inner critic's voice. You'll react instead of respond. This is normal. This is part of the process. The goal isn't perfection, it's gradual, accumulating change. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but over time the trajectory bends toward freedom. What does freedom look like? Not a life without difficult thoughts. Not a mind that's always peaceful. Not the elimination of self-doubt or fear. Freedom is being able to hold these experiences without being controlled by them. It's having a difficult thought and recognizing it as a thought, not a truth. It's feeling anxiety and choosing to act from your values anyway. It's hearing the inner critic and responding with understanding rather than belief or resistance. Freedom is knowing that the loudest voice in your head is not the most accurate, it's just the most practiced. And you can practice something different. This is the invitation, to gradually outgrow the inner critic. Not to silence it, but to recognize it as one voice among many. To see it as an echo from an ancient past, doing its best to protect you, but no longer qualified to define you. You are not your thoughts. You are not your inner critic. You are the awareness that can hold all of this with compassion and clarity. And that awareness, that conscious presence, is already free. It's always been free. You've just been too identified with the critic to notice. Understanding that is the first act of freedom. The journey from here is yours. The practices are available. The path is clear. The inner critic will speak, but you no longer have to listen. You can choose differently. You can respond instead of react. You can observe instead of identify. You can extend to yourself the same compassion you'd offer to anyone else who is struggling. This is your mind. These are your thoughts. And you have more power over your relationship with them than you've ever been taught. The inner critic evolved to keep you alive. Honor that. Understand that. And then, gently, persistently, compassionately, teach it that you're safe. Teach it that not every thought needs to be believed. Teach it that you can be aware of fear without being controlled by fear. This is the work, and it's the most important work there is. Take a breath, notice what's here, and begin.